Good evening, everyone. My name is Joseph Fincher, and I did my senior research project on PTSD in local law enforcement officers. A little bit about me. I'm a senior at Magna Vista High School. I plan to attend Virginia Tech in the fall, where I will pursue a pre-law degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. I chose this project because my father is a police chief in this region. PTSD is a disorder that affects millions across the country, so I believe it needs to be studied further. Also, I wanted to choose a project that would be beneficial towards understanding the police in our community. PTSD, which stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, includes intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares, and mood changes. This is according to the American Psychiatric Association. PTSD is caused by traumatic experiences, which police generally face more often. Police have to go through child abuse cases, seeing dead bodies, the threat of serious injury. These are all examples of the traumatic experiences that police generally face more often than most civilians. A 2021 experiment performed by DeRoche and her colleagues found that police officers with PTSD performed worse in cognitive performance areas. Other studies found this included executive functioning and memory. Other studies found that people with PTSD had trouble concentrating and a lower overall quality of life. This lower quality of life can lead to other disorders such as depression. Overall, PTSD is negative for the interactions that police have in our community. PTSD affects decision making, so if a critical situation were to occur, a police officer with PTSD would not be able to make the best judgment call and could lead to unnecessary actions such as increased use of force incidents. There are many forms of treatment for PTSD. One form of treatment that was found effective in a 2018 study by Smith and his colleagues was eclectic psychotherapy. This form of therapy attempts to change the way that officers and, truthfully, anyone in general feel about their traumatic experiences. I talked with the chief of the Martinsville Police Department. He says that his department utilizes similar position and rank counseling. Let's say a sergeant was going through something. They could go onto this app, type in that they're a sergeant, and they can talk to another sergeant from another department anonymously. A third form of treatment is solving the issue of traumatic experiences in order to lower the rate of PTSD. The FBI says that this can be done through community policing. Community policing is when officers attempt to build close relationships with the community they serve. In doing so, this reduces the amount of crime and thus the amount of traumatic experiences that officers face. This all leads to my research question, which is, how does the percentage of law enforcement officers with PTSD in Southside Virginia compare to the national percentage? For my study, I used the PCL-5, which is a questionnaire that assesses the symptoms of PTSD to determine if the disorder is present. It was created by the Department of Veterans Affairs. The PCL-5 asks how much individuals experience certain symptoms. For example, one question asks, how much were you bothered by unwanted memories of a traumatic experience? The PCL-5 has a built-in scoring method. Overall, each answer is scored in total, and the total score determines whether or not PTSD is likely. The answer options range from none for each question, which added 0 points to the total score, to extremely, which added 4 points to the participant's total score. I used a Google form to create my study. The first page had a consent form, which told the officers what they would be completing and that their identities would be completely anonymous, even to myself. The second page had generic questions, such as, how long have you been a law enforcement officer? The third page had 18 questions from the PCL-5. I had to remove 2 questions from the PCL-5 because they talked about harming others, and I wanted to remove any liability on my end as far as having to report the officer for this type of situation. Overall, I had 57 law enforcement officers respond to my survey. These included officers from the Patrick County Sheriff's Office, the Henry County Sheriff's Office, the Martinsville Police Department, the Martinsville Sheriff's Office, and the Patrick and Henry Community College Police Department, as well as the Pittsylvania County Sheriff's Office, the Danville Police Department, and the Chatham Police Department. Each participant's answers were scored in total. A score of 29 or higher meant that the officer likely had PTSD. The total scores could range from 0, which was the lowest, to 72, which was the highest. After I randomized my results, I found that around 6.5% of my sample of Southside Virginia law enforcement officers had PTSD. However, a national survey I found said that 11% of law enforcement officers in the United States have PTSD. So as you can see from these, based off these percentages, there's a slight difference, but I had to run a statistical test to determine if this difference was significant or not. Based on the national survey results, you could expect that the percentage of law enforcement officers with PTSD in Southside Virginia is 11%. However, I wanted to see if this percentage was different from 11%. Because I'm taking my sample data and comparing it to the national claim, I decided to run a 1 proportion z-test. My data passed all the conditions. For randomization, I randomly chose 46 law enforcement officers from my survey. The normality of my data shows that it is representative of all law enforcement officers in Southside Virginia. The independence condition shows that each participant's answers were unique to that individual officer and does not overlap. I ran my test at a 0.05 level of significance and a 95% confidence level. Although there's a 5% chance that my results will be insignificant, I can be 95% confident that the results I get will be correct. After running the test, I found that my test statistic, which was the z-score, was around negative 0.971. This means that my data was around 1 standard deviation below the mean, which isn't very far. My p-value was around 0.332. This means that if the proportion and percentage of law enforcement officer PTSD in this region really is 11%, there's a 33.2% chance that I'd get the same results that I shared earlier. Because this percentage is very high, we can assume that the difference between the sample results I shared earlier and the national survey results is likely based on chance rather than an actual statistical difference. My p-value was lower than my level of significance, meaning that I failed to reject my null hypothesis. I do not have sufficient evidence that the proportion of law enforcement officers with PTSD in Southside Virginia is different than 11%. I found that law enforcement officer PTSD is not lower or higher in this region compared to the rest of the United States. I believe this is the case because officers face the same type of situations and traumatic experiences all across the United States, no matter how small or big the city. This is important for police agencies and training facilities throughout Southside Virginia. Although this proportion is not different of PTSD in this area, it's important that we reduce this proportion as much as possible. My study had a few limitations. For one, I had middle option bias in my study. This is when participants are provided with a range of score options. For example, mine had none to extremely. People most of the time just go through, click the middle option all the way down the page. This could skew my results. One way that this could be done is by either the Department of Veterans Affairs or any future researcher changing the format of the way answers are provided to the participants. Another limitation of my study was the mental health stigmatization that exists in America. This could prevent officers from sharing how they truly feel about their own experiences and whether or not they've actually faced any symptoms. One way that this could be fixed is by continuing to be more open about mental health in America. The more open we are about our mental health struggles in America, the more that people, and especially for my example, law enforcement officers, will feel more comfortable to share their own experiences. Future research could focus on the proportion of PTSD in different regions of Virginia, as well as different regions of the United States. Also, future research could focus on different types of police officers. My study only focused on law enforcement officers who enforce laws. However, future research could focus on correctional officers who work in jails or civil process officers who serve legal papers. I want to give a big thanks to all agencies and officers who participated in my study. I want to thank Ms. Spencer for being such a big help with my research project. I want to thank Mrs. Harrell for being a big help with the math section of my project. And finally, I want to thank all the judges and audience members that are here today. I'll now take questions.
Joseph, in the Veterans Affairs survey, are they asked to identify from their perspective if they have suffered or experienced a traumatic event, or is trauma assumed based on their position?
Right, it's a trauma assumed survey, sorry. There are different forms of the PCL-5. Some are specifically for veterans, others are just for generic civilians, and this changed the way that some of the questions were asked, but for the most part, it was assumed that it was all trauma, assumed that they've all experienced trauma.
All right, forgive me if you mentioned this and it just slipped my mind, but was there any differentiation in that? I believe it was 11.5% nationwide. Did that define the officers' ranking, or was it just law enforcement officers, in general?
Right, it was just law enforcement officers. It didn't focus on the other type of officers that I mentioned. It was just law enforcement officers, and the survey that I was referencing was performed by the U.S. Marshal Service, and it was actually sent out to every state sort of police agency head. So in Virginia, it was sent out to the Virginia Chiefs of Police Association, and it was sent out to these different agencies who then distributed it to the law enforcement officers in their departments.
So you use law enforcement officers, and you did mention, and I saw pictures of people who actually are responsible for prisons.
Right.
How do you think this study might adapt to firefighters and EMS?
So firefighters and EMS were also included in the national survey that I was referencing. They had a slightly different, slightly higher, proportion of PTSD in America. They had, I believe it was 12% PTSD, comparison to 11% for law enforcement officers. I believe it all just depends on the types of scenarios they face. Although fire and EMS face different types of traumatic experiences, there's also a lot of overlap between the two, and they both face traumatic experiences way too often. And so I believe that their proportion of PTSD would be around the same.
In your survey results, did you find that those you asked, you asked them the years of service that they had? Did you find that those with the most years of service were more likely to have PTSD, or did that matter?
So actually, it was a little surprising to me. Well, for one, the range of years I used was 1 to 4 years of experience, 5 to 9 years of experience, and then 10 plus years of experience. I want to say that I do not have the proper sample size for each of these individual years, which is why I just grouped them all together. However, based on my sample data, I found that actually the 1 to 4 years of service actually had a slightly higher percentage of PTSD than the others. I believe theirs was around 23% versus the others were around 15 and a bit lower, but they were all sort of similar, but like I said, the 1 to 4 was slightly higher.
Next up, we have Reagan.
Good evening. My name is Reagan Wright, and I did my study on bringing a Nike store to Henry County. A little bit about me is that I currently attend Martinsville High School, and I plan to go to VCU to study forensic science. And I chose this project because I feel like our area could use more things population of this area is not the highest compared to other areas that are around us and other places in general, but we could use more people to get more money and bring in our population to grow our population. We have a few attraction spots in our area, like the the raceway and the Philpott Lake, which brings in people to our area, but usually like the speed track, this race course, usually only brings in people for a certain amount of time. So if we have permanent stores, it will bring in more people to our area that will stay. If we want to bring in more people to our area, we want to accommodate to their needs and find things that they would like, so they would actually want to stay and come to our area to spend this money to help support it. So according to a few different research articles that I studied, the people tend to look for more natural sceneries, which is more like unique things people can't find anywhere else, as example for like our Philpott Lake. People also look for things to entertain them, so they'll want to keep coming back to our area to keep them wanting to spend money in our area to also help support it. And then people look for just unique things in general that they can't find anywhere else, which is what's going to help them want to stay in our area. And things that could affect the shopping habits for bringing in a store would be online shopping does decrease local businesses and other places around our area. And if you go out shopping in public, you can actually get to try on things and know what you're buying. And then you also have to go outside and you can actually be out and talk to people and do things like that. And our employment rate is not the highest around our area according to the U.S. Census. And we could bring that up by bringing more people into our area with a new store. If more people want to stay in this area, we can have more people work in these stores. And local support, bringing in a new store, for example, like a shoe store or anything like that, other people who are out actually shopping will want to go to eat somewhere, which will support local food businesses. And then also people who are just staying, they could also help hotels in our area. So I chose shoes specifically to focus on because shoes have multiple purposes. You could use them just for walking around, and there's also just sports. If you play a specific sport, you can use shoes for that. And local benefits would be going out to these stores. You actually need shoes to wear to go to these places. And most people tend to lean towards certain brands. According to a study done by Power in 2022, people tend to lean towards more specific brands rather than just random products that they find. So people are satisfied with those brands if they know what they're actually getting. So this leads me to my question of what employment rate would it take to bring a Nike store here? During my research process, I decided to Google the closest Nike store locations. I decided to focus on Nike because several of my articles that I've read stated that Nike was, if not the most popular shoe brand store there is. So I chose the closest location to us, which would be around Williamsburg, to compare the rates. This is from the U.S. Census Bureau, the Henry County's rates, and Williamsburg's are side by side here, as you can see in the chart. So I compared the two rates. I had the two different cities side by side and looked at both of them, and I documented these into a Google document. So this leads me to my hypothesis. My null hypothesis, which is what we assume to be true, is that Henry County's unemployment rate is less than or equal to Williamsburg's, while my alternative hypothesis, which is what I'm trying to prove, is that Henry County's unemployment rates are greater than Williamsburg's unemployment rates. And I tested this at a 0.05 alpha level, which means that I will be 95% confident in my results. On this graph, you can see that the yellow, which is Williamsburg, is leaning more towards the right, which means that they have lower unemployment rates than Henry County, which is evenly spread out across the graph. And I had to test for normality since my sample size was only 15 when around the recommended is 30 to just see if there was any outliers in my data to make sure it would still be statistically significant. So I tested this to find the averages of these unemployment rates, which Henry County's is around 8.3, while Williamsburg's is around 2.6. And the standard deviation, which is basically the variance of these averages, was around 4 for Henry County's and around 1.9 for Williamsburg's. And my t-statistic, which is basically how the difference between these two averages, is around 1.7. Since since I was comparing the means of two samples, this led me to complete a two-sample t-test. And when I completed that test, I got a p-value of around 0.04, which is less than my alpha level of 0.05, which means that I would reject my null hypothesis, which means that I have significant evidence to prove that Henry County's unemployment rates are greater than Williamsburg's. And since Henry County's unemployment is not the best and it is less than Williamsburg's, that means that there could be several things we could do to get that up, which would be like bringing in a store like Nike, since it has a variety of different items. We could bring in these new stores. So that would improve our area and bring more people here, which would actually spend money to help us improve our area. There were a few limitations in my process, which would be a small sample size. The recommended amount of samples to have is around 30, which I only had 15, so I had to test for normality. So future researchers should have a bigger sample size. And then COVID was also a factor in this, because COVID could prove that there were outliers in my data. So there could have been outliers to affect what my results had come out as. And then I would also suggest choosing several different locations rather than only comparing it to Williamsburg, so that way there are more accurate results when you complete the test. I want to say thank you to Ms. Spencer for helping me through my research process, Ms. Harrell for helping me through my stats, and the judges and audience for coming to listen tonight. And I will now be taking questions.
Reagan, you mentioned the idea of increasing employment, I guess, in our area. In your research, did you determine about how many people are employed at those retail stores like that in other areas like Williamsburg?
Yes, in my research I found that more people actually do tend to go work at more places that have shoes and things like clothing, because people just tend to like those things better. So they do have a higher employment rate at stores like that compared to like fast food restaurants or things around there. And also our area doesn't have as many stores to buy things like that, so I feel like more people will be willing to work there.
I think you kind of answered this question already, but I know there are Nike outlets as well. But in your research, were you looking at just the traditional Nike store, or were outlets included in that, in what you were looking at?
In my research, there were both outlets and stores, and they didn't really make too much of a difference, so I included both of them in my research.
As part of how businesses come into communities, did you explore what some of the population requirements Nike had in order to enter into that area's market?
I did actually look on the official website for Nike. You can go on there and actually see things like bringing it to a location if you want a Nike to be there. But they didn't have really any specific requirements to actually bring a store here, so that's why I also went along with Nike.
With Williamsburg being a high tourist area, do you think that shows a difference between our two areas? They have a lot of tourists. Do you think that's why they would have their store be more successful?
I do feel like that does play a factor in it, because there are many people going there for many different reasons, which is why I think a store like this will help our area eventually become like that, to bring more tourists in.
So you said that you use the unemployment rate to look at if Nike can come here or not. Why unemployment rates?
Because I feel like unemployment rates would be one of the main factors, because if we don't have people to work at these new stores that we're trying to bring in, then it won't be successful for our area. So I decided to focus on that, so we could try to up the employment
mental health is extremely important to me, and I know from personal experience that it is more challenging to go through certain things alone than it is when you have people around you who know what you're going through. I also believe that socialization is extremely important, and I felt that this was the best topic to choose because of the career path that I want to take after college. There are many different types of group therapy, and some relative types are in person, online, and 12-step recovery groups. There are also specific types such as Narcotics Anonymous, which is participant-led, cancer support groups, which are either participant-led or professional-led, Alcoholics Anonymous, which are participant-led. Group therapy provides many different things, and one thing that I saw that it provided most was a safe place. All of my articles said in some way, shape, or form that their participants felt like their support group was a safer place to go, and that they felt less judged, so they felt more able to talk about whatever they were dealing with. Then there's stability, and the Carolian Center for Grief and Healing said that their participants felt more of a sense of stability because as they were attending a certain support group at the same place, at the same time, every week or month, with the same people, they felt like they were able to talk about what they were dealing with, and whether it was cancer or addiction or anything like that, they felt like they were able to not feel judged, and it led to a sense of stability. Then there's support, and the participants of every support group overall felt more supportive because as they were talking about whatever they were dealing with, the people around them knew exactly what they were going through, and it just made it easier for them to share their stories. For long-term effects, as I said before, there was emotional support, and a study conducted in 2022 by Zhang was on college students, and it tested if they felt more supported before or after attending support group. And overall, a majority of the college students felt way more supported after. Then there's facilitated growth, and most of the participants had facilitated growth because as they were attending support group, they were able to talk more, whether it was beginning it and not being able to talk at all for fear that they would be judged. After a few sessions, they felt that they were able to talk and they were able to cope with whatever they were dealing with better. Then there's mental resilience, and mental resilience just means being able to adapt to change. And as you deal with cancer or sexual assault or anything like that, you have to be able to adapt to change. There were many treatments tested that I saw, but 3 that stuck out to me were STARE. This was for veterans in the armed forces with PTSD. Then there was AWARE, and this was for Asian Americans who just didn't really feel supported in America, and these were 2 traditionally run support groups. The third one, however, was more of an experimental kind of thing. This one was called Photo Voice, and for Photo Voice, this is for bereaved adults, and bereavement just means loss of a loved one. And what they would do is they would take a picture of an item that reminded them of their lost loved one, and they would write a story about it. And after they wrote the story and took the picture and everything, they would take it to the support group, and they would share it with the support group. And most of the stories were honestly the same, even if the object was different. So this led me to my research question, which is, are support groups beneficial to lowering stress levels? For my processes, I recruited teachers from the Martinsville and Henry County area by email, and then I created 2 Google Forms. One was for people who had attended a support group in their past, and one was for individuals that had not. For my method, I needed to get informed consent before I could continue my study, so on the first page of the Google form, the participants had to sign a consent form, and if they did not sign the consent form, they were unable to continue. questions, there weren't many questions that were the same on both Google Forms, but there was one that was related to stress levels. And on the one where people had attended a support group, the question stated, how would you rate your stress levels, low, medium, or high, after attending a support group? And for people that had not attended a support group, it was just how would you rate your stress levels, low, medium, or high overall. And my sample size was 130, but I lowered it to 72, 36 in the group that had attended a support group and 36 that had not. For my hypotheses, my null hypothesis, which is what is assumed, is that there is not an association between support group attendance and stress levels. And for my alternative hypothesis, which is what I am testing, is there is an association between support group attendance and stress levels. For my Google Form results, my observed counts, which is what I gathered from my Google Form, were that for people who had attended a support group, all 36 said they had low stress levels. And for the individuals that had not attended a group, there were 5 who said they had low stress levels, 10 who said they had medium stress levels, and 21 who said they had high stress levels. Then for my expected counts, which is what I would be expected to get if my null hypothesis were true, they were obviously the same for both groups. So for both people who had and had not attended a support group, low stress levels were 20.5, medium stress levels were 5, and high stress levels were 10.5. For my expected and observed counts, this is a graph for people that had attended a support group. And as you can see, the observed counts are remarkably different on all low, medium, and high for their stress levels. And then for people that had not attended a support group, they're still significantly different for expected and observed counts. This led me to conduct a chi-square test for association, and I had an alpha level of 0.05, which means that I'm 95% confident in my results. For my conditions, the only condition for a chi-square test is that at least 80% of the expected counts have to be greater than or equal to 5, and all of mine met that condition. My test statistic was 54.59, and a higher test statistic means that it is more likely that the alternative hypothesis will be true. I had a p-value of relatively 0, and this is the percent chance that I would have gotten the results that I got if my null hypothesis were true, which led me to reject my null hypothesis. Which means that I have evidence to support that there is an association between support group attendance and stress levels. And on the Google form for people that had attended a support group, the last question asked if they had any further statements to better help my study. And there were many personal stories, but 3 that I have to share with you today are, for participant A, she was dealing with the loss of her mother, and she attended a support group, and she said that it overall helped put her life back together. For participant B, he was dealing with the aftermath of sexual assault, and he said that before the group, he couldn't look in the mirror, and he wasn't able to love himself at all. But after attending the group, he started to be able to look in the mirror and see himself again, and he was able to start loving himself and realize it wasn't his fault. And finally, for participant C, they're a non-binary individual, and they attended a support group for the LGBTQ+ community, and they said that without the group that they attended, they probably wouldn't be here today. So before I move on to the next slide, I wanted to thank those participants for sharing their stories with me. For my limitations, I had a small sample size. While the recommended sample size is 30 in each group, and I had 36, I feel like it would be better to have a much larger sample size. Then my research was not, my study was not representative of the entire population, because I only got responses from teachers with the Martinsville and Henry County school systems. My recommendations for future researchers are obviously that they have a larger sample size and that they are representative of either all of Martinsville and Henry County or the state of Virginia or wherever they're deciding to try the study. I would also also recommend that they test stress levels of the individuals before attending the support group, and then create a mock support group and test the stress levels after. I would like to thank Ms. Spencer for helping me through this entire process, Ms. Whitaker for helping me with the math, my participants for sharing all of their stories with me, and the audience and judges for being here today. I will now take questions from the judges.
Kara, it seemed like you had a really high number of responses from teachers, and you ended up reducing that sample to 72. What process did you use to reduce the sample size?
On the calculators that we are